This is the Cadillac ATS-V. It was Cadillac's first direct competitor to the BMW M3. This isn't the first V car, of course. There were two great CTS-Vs before it, but Cadillac had been building V cars basically the same way for 2 generations and over 10 years before this one. With no compact cars offered, it would take the bigger CTS, upgrade the suspension, and stuff a small block V8 from the bad so could rid around. But the ATS-V is different. Built in the smallest version of the lightweight chassis codenamed Alpha, it was developed specifically with a new generation of Cadillacs in mind. It was the smallest, lightest, and best balanced V car ever. And instead of a V8, a bespoke new twin-turbo 6-cylinder engine was developed for it like most of its competitors. Honed in the Nürburgring like all V cars, the suspension used a 3rd generation magnetic ride control, and an electronic limited slip diff splits power out back based on which wheel has the most traction. There was a 5-mode traction control system as standard to help you approach the car's massive limits. Cadillac pulled out all the stops. But despite all of that, it never really sold all that well. So was it actually any good?
Here's one thing that a lot of people won't tell you about this car. Everyone's complaining about how small it is, how little space you have in the back compared to the BMW, and the BMW isn't heavy. It weighs about the same as this car in most versions, and the M4 is actually about 100 pounds lighter. But you can't tell when you drive this car. And challenge anyone to drive this M4 and tell me that it feels heavier. And here's one of the biggest reasons. This car has actually a fairly short wheelbase. In fact, it's the shortest in its class. And the reason why is that Cadillac benchmarking E46 3 Series whilst developing this, as opposed to only benchmarking for its and greatest, because they wanted this car to feel like the E46, which a lot of people consider to be the best 3 Series generation. And this car feels like it. Compared to the M4 actually has a wheelbase that's closer to the E39 5 Series, which is the same generation as the E46. And that shows in how the car handles, because it feels a lot more nimble and a lot more agile. And what's even more impressive is that Cadillac kept most of the weight within the wheelbase. So because there's not much weight outside of the wheelbase on the overhangs on the front and the back, the car manages weight so beautifully that it feels like a much lighter car than it is. And certainly compared to the M4, it feels lighter. So if you're worried that this car feels heavier compared to the M4, go drive both and come back and tell me that it actually feels heavier, because I guarantee you, you can't. A lot of people will say, I'm not going to pay that much money for a car like this with a V6. And it may not be a big, deep-breathing V8. It may not be a velvety, smooth, straight 6 like BMW uses, but there is a lot of benefit to a V6. Because a straight 6 engine is taller and it's longer, whereas a V6 engine is more compact. So it allows you to put the engine further back in the chassis and lower down, which keeps weight closer to the center of gravity, keeps center of gravity lower. So it helps the car perform better. Obviously, Cadillac didn't just take the V6 and throw a couple turbos on it. It didn't even use the V-Sport engine per se. It started with that one. It throws most of it away, keeps the block and the forged crank, and then everything else is new, and it's actually closely related to the ATS-VR engine that Cadillac fielded in Early World Challenge. Now, Cadillac has a lot of experience in that series. It actually won many times in many polls with the CTS-VR before this, and the first year out this car came, the ATS-VR, it also won. The biggest question to ask is, how does this engine compare to the S55 and the M4? And I've actually driven the M4 on track, and I'm going to leave a link in the video description, but I can't dispute that the S55 is an absolute masterpiece. It's a torque monster. It makes torque, starts making peak torque at 1500 RPM, and it stays there the entire way. And when you drive it, it's actually kind of mesmerizing how much power it makes, how early on, and how long it stays in the RPM range. But after you get that initial impression, it starts to get kind of old, because the engine so easily overpowers the rear wheels that it leaves us a very strong impression that it's almost like a muscle car. It's more engine than chassis, which is all sorts of wrong for an M car. M car is supposed to be about precision and finesse, and it's supposed to be more chassis than power, which the M4 isn't. This car, on the other hand, feels very progressive. The compressor wheels and the turbos were actually tuned for high RPMs. That means they can make better boosts. They don't run out of breath at high RPMs, but it also means that they build boost a lot more progressively. So unlike the M4, where boost hits very strong early on, this car builds power a lot more progressively. Now, it's very important to keep in mind the difference between turbo lag and power curve. Turbo lag is how long it takes when you put your foot down for power to start building and turbos to spool. This car doesn't really have that turbo lag. Not any worse than most of its competitors anyway. What this car differs, though, is how progressively it builds torque. So when you put your foot down, you get power. You don't get delay. But the amount of power that makes it low RPMs is more manageable. So it starts building power more progressively and more smoothly. It's far more controllable than the M4. So when I drove the M4, for instance, there are two options. You can leave traction control on, in which case it'll be fighting you every step of the way. In fact, it was so bad that I had traction control light flashing on the back straight in our track. Every time you hit a bump, every time you hit an undulation, you hit the rumble strips, it always lets go and traction control comes on. This car isn't like that. This car builds power a lot more progressively. When you're coming out of a turn and you put your foot down, you can much more easily manage how much power you want at the wheels. And the M4 isn't like that. The M4, you're either fighting the traction control system or you're fighting the back end. It's almost one or the other most of the way. On a big power track with long sweepers and long straightaways, it may not be as bothersome, but on a short technical track, it starts to get old really quickly. This car doesn't make peak torque until 3,500 RPM. 3,500 RPM in a twin turbo car. It's brilliant. It feels a lot more controllable, whereas the M4 compared to this, it feels like a sledgehammer. And speaking of feel, there is a lot of it. I am so happy to say that there is a lot of feel in this car. I mean, you can chuck this car into a corner and it just sticks for a car that's completely stock. And I've actually driven this car with fairly narrow front tires with 235 Pilot Sport 4S's, and I have never driven a stock car that is this well balanced. There's so much front end grip and so much feel and response. In fact, there's probably only one company that does better modern electric steering than this Porsche. That's it. That's something that used to be an M quality, a BMW M quality, distinct features, how good the feel is. The way this car actually feels when you chug it into a corner should be taught to everyone who's trying to make a car like this, a high performance sports sedan. Well, obviously, a lot of that feel and a lot of that handling is down to the magnetic ride control. When Cadillac first released this, it said that it has a third generation magnetic ride control which can respond to the road 40% quicker than the generation before it. What that means is that the suspension can stay soft and compliant most of the time, but it reacts more quickly when it needs to stiffen up and control body movements. There's just nothing that upsets the car. It's so much fun to drive because the steering wheel lets you know exactly how much grip you have at the front tires, exactly what the tires are doing, so you can chuck it into a corner and you know exactly how fast you can go. Because of the controllable power, you know exactly how much power to give it, and it's so easy and so approachable, so much fun to drive. It's like nothing else in this class, the way this car responds. There's one to pick on this car, it's transmission. And that's not because it's bad, it's just that if you compare it to the dual clutch, GM has said a lot of times that the 8-speed auto in this car competes and compares well to the best dual clutch transmission. That was actually referring to the Porsche PDK. And this transmission does shift very quickly. The only problem is that it can be caught off guard. So with a dual clutch transmission, obviously inherently it has the upper gear and the lower gear from where you are already ready to be selected. And that's the best thing, is that you can't really catch it off guard. It's ready to upshift or downshift with the next gear. This transmission is different with a torque converter. So if you are not on the car, if you're not driving on track, or you're just enjoying it on a nice back road and the car is expecting you to upshift or downshift, it can be caught off guard and the transmission doesn't shift as quickly or as sharp. And compared to the M4, the one that I actually drove did have a dual clutch, the dual clutch option, and it is a little bit sharper. But aside from that, if you're on it, it shifts really, really quickly. It may not be the best out there, but there isn't a car that's the best at everything. Certainly not the M4. And this car actually shifts really well for what it is. And wide open throttle up shifts are almost instantaneous. They are really almost as quick as PDK. And the downshifts are a little bit less sharp, maybe a little bit slower. But aside from that, that may be the only thing you can pick on the car. It's hardly even a complaint. In my opinion, because if there's anything that I would have not be perfect in the car, I'd much rather be the transmission be a little bit slower than the best dual clutch. And if you don't like it, get the manual. This car has an excellent manual transmission. I don't have it in this one, but the manual that comes with this car as an option is a fantastic transmission. I can't believe how much fun to drive it is.
Here's the thing. If your heart is already set on a BMW M3 or an M4, I probably can't say anything to change your mind, but I can challenge you to go drive an ATS-V. There is no car that combines practicality, comfort, and handling quite like it. The way the car feels once you start pushing it is textbook. And if all-out power is more your thing, there are cars with a few bolt-ons and a tune running 10-second quarter miles, including a manual car. This car is all things to all people. It's exactly what a high-performance sports sedan should be like. Yes, I know, the backseat is a bit cramped, but it's supposed to be a small car. Want more space? Buy a bigger car. What Cadillac did here is incredible. Took the old 3 Series recipe and brought it up to modern standards. It's a shame it never sold that well. Hopefully the next proper new car that replaces it stays true to this form.